The year was 1893, and Jacob Thorne was a man of faith. He had spent the better part of his life as a devout scholar of the Old Testament, immersed in the ancient texts that revealed the grand mysteries of the Bible. As an archaeologist and theologian, he had spent years traveling to the Middle East, searching for signs of ancient civilizations. On this particular day, he was standing at the edge of what was believed to be the ancient site of Sodom, a place steeped in biblical lore and long, thought to be cursed. Jacob had spent years trying to find this city, studying the scriptures and the writings of those who had dared to search before him. He wasn't prepared for what he was about to uncover. The scorching heat of the desert sun beat down on him as he wiped the sweat from his brow. The landscape was desolate, nothing but dry sand and jagged rocks in every direction. He was alone, save for a small crew of local guides who had led him to the site. They, too, spoke of the dangers that awaited them. According to legend, this was the place where fire and brimstone had rained down from the heavens, consuming everything in its path. The destruction of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah was said to be a divine judgment against the evil that had taken root there. But what if there was more to this story than the scriptures revealed? As Jacob wandered further into the site, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, with a presence he couldn't identify. The ruins before him were far more than the simple remnants of ancient cities. There was something unnatural about them, as if the land itself still carried the scars of the catastrophe that had occurred thousands of years ago. The stone structures seemed to loom over him, their broken walls whispering secrets of a forgotten world. This place, once a thriving center of commerce and excess, had been reduced to nothing but rubble. But what had truly happened here? Was this the result of nature's fury, or had a far greater force been at work? Jacob moved closer to the ruins, his boots crunching over the cracked earth. The closer he got to the center of the site, the more he felt a peculiar pressure building in his chest, as if the very air around him was charged with some lingering force. He paused at the base of a massive stone structure, what appeared to be the remnants of a once grand temple. The stone was blackened, scorched beyond recognition. It reminded him of the biblical descriptions of fire and sulfur raining down from the heavens. It was said that the cities had become places of indescribable evil. Pride, corruption, and violence had overtaken them. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah had indulged in every form of excess, their moral compass so twisted that even the most sacred laws had been forgotten, and for that, they had been destroyed. As he knelt to examine the ruins, something caught his eye. It wasn't the blackened stone or the piles of broken pottery. No, this was different. The sand in the crevices of the stone glimmered as though something had been left behind. Jacob leaned in closer, and his heart skipped a beat when he realized what it was. A small, charred statue of a woman, half buried in the sand. Her features were distorted, almost grotesque, as if she'd been melted into shape by the very fire that had consumed the city. But what shocked him more than the statue itself was the unmistakable inscription on its base. It was written in an ancient script, one that he had studied in his research, a language used by the early inhabitants of the cities. But it wasn't just any inscription. It was a curse, a warning that had been carved into stone centuries ago, perhaps by the very people who had witnessed the horrors of their world come to an end. Jacob felt a chill run down his spine. The implications of his discovery were far more disturbing than he had imagined. He knew from his studies that Sodom and Gomorrah had been places of unimaginable depravity, rituals involving human sacrifice, the abuse of strangers, and the indulgence in every form of sin. But this statue, this cursed object, felt different. It was as if the very essence of the city's darkness had been trapped within it. He had come to understand that the cities had been destroyed for their rejection of divine principles, but he never anticipated that their sins would leave a lingering mark, a tangible trace that could still be felt to this day. Jacob felt an intense unease settle over him, as if the weight of centuries of sin was pressing down on him. He carefully brushed away the sand from the statue, his fingers trembling as he touched the blackened stone. The curse, which seemed so ancient and incomprehensible, appeared to have been left as a warning, a testament to the evil that had once consumed this place. As he continued to examine the statue, his mind raced with the stories he had heard about the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. The scripture described them as a people who had sunk so deep into sin that even the angels of the Lord could not find a single righteous soul among them. Jacob had studied these tales from a theological standpoint, but now, standing in the ruins of these cities, he felt the truth of those words press upon him in a way he hadn't anticipated. The legend told of how the two cities had flourished with unimaginable wealth, where trade, luxury, and indulgence thrived. But with that prosperity came a complete abandonment of morality. The streets, once lined with the opulence of the rich, were now silent and barren, littered only with the remnants of a society lost to its vices. Jacob's heart beat faster as he thought of the men of Sodom, those who had surrounded the house of Lot, demanding to abuse the visitors who had come to warn the city. It was the ultimate proof of the depths of their depravity, the violence, the arrogance, the rejection of kindness and compassion. It all seemed so intangible now. The world they had built was one that traded love and justice for lust and violence. The fact that nothing had survived here except ashes and ruins felt like the final, inevitable conclusion to such a world. But as Jacob looked around, he began to wonder if this was truly the end, or had something more sinister transpired here, something that reached beyond the physical destruction. Jacob stood there for what felt like an eternity, his mind swirling with questions that had no immediate answers. He carefully placed the cursed statue back into the sand, as if the act itself might somehow unlock more of the past. The desert wind howled, sending small grains of sand swirling into the air, and for a moment he could almost hear whispers carried by the wind, like the voices of the long-dead inhabitants of this place, still echoing their final cries. It was as if the land itself mourned what had been lost, and the magnitude of the judgment that had come upon these cities seemed almost too overwhelming to comprehend. Jacob could feel a presence, something beyond the physical, something that refused to be ignored. He had heard stories of the strange phenomena that had surrounded the city's destruction, of fire and brimstone raining down from the sky, consuming everything in its path. But standing here now, it didn't feel like an ancient story. It felt alive, like it was still happening in some way. His thoughts were interrupted by a strange sound, a low, rumbling vibration beneath his feet. At first, it was so subtle that he wasn't sure if it was his imagination playing tricks on him. But then the ground trembled again, this time more forcefully. Jacob's heart raced as he looked around, his eyes scanning the desolate landscape. The sand seemed to shift in places, moving almost as if something were stirring beneath the surface. Was it possible that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah hadn't completely eradicated the evil that once lived here? As the vibrations grew stronger, Jacob took a cautious step back, his instincts telling him to retreat, but there was nowhere to go. The site was surrounded by barren desert, and the feeling of being trapped in the midst of something ancient, something far beyond his understanding, was overwhelming. Suddenly the sand before him began to shift violently, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat as a crack formed in the ground. It was wide at first, then widened further, as if something was emerging from the depths of the earth itself. The air grew thick with an unbearable heat, and for a moment he thought he could smell sulfur, sharp, acrid, and unmistakable. It was a smell he had read about in biblical texts associated with divine wrath. The crack widened even more, and Jacob's legs trembled beneath him. Something was rising from the earth, something old and terrifying, something that had been buried here, forgotten by time, but not by the forces that had once ruled over this land. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his feet refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, caught between the curiosity of an explorer and the fear of a man who had witnessed something far beyond his understanding. Out of the crack, something began to emerge, a figure shrouded in smoke and shadow. It was like a mirage, but the feeling of its presence was unmistakable, as if the very ground beneath him was alive. The shape began to take form, and Jacob felt his heart pound in his chest. It was humanoid, but not quite human, its outline distorted and shifting, as if it couldn't decide what shape it should take. The air grew colder, and the smell of sulfur became almost unbearable. The figure moved closer, and Jacob could see it more clearly now. A towering, dark silhouette, with eyes that glowed like molten fire. Its voice, when it spoke, was like the crackling of fire, deep and guttural. The kind of voice that carried centuries of malice and despair. "You seek knowledge," it said, the words echoing in Jacob's mind. "But you are not ready for what you will find?" Jacob's legs quivered, his breath shallow as he watched the figure take shape before him. The crack in the earth widened, and the shadowy figure rose, impossibly tall, its form blurred by the swirling dust and heat. The desert air seemed to pulse, heavy with a presence that Jacob could neither explain nor escape. His mind screamed at him to turn and run, but his feet were glued to the sand, as if the ground itself held him captive. The figure's eyes were two burning orbs of fire, and as it slowly began to move toward him, the temperature rose to a suffocating heat. Jacob could feel sweat pouring down his face, his heart thundering in his chest. The air felt thick, almost solid, as if the very atmosphere was charged with something ancient and malevolent. He tried to gather his thoughts, but they scattered like sand in the wind. Was this a remnant of the destruction that had wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah? Or had he uncovered something far worse, something that had been buried for centuries, waiting for the right moment to rise again? The figure's form twisted as it drew nearer, its shape constantly shifting, like the very fabric of reality could not contain it. The ground beneath Jacob's feet groaned, as though the earth was being torn apart by the weight of the figure's presence. Then the voice came, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate the air itself. "You seek knowledge, but what you will find here is not for the living," it said, its voice echoing with the depth of ages, as if it had existed before the dawn of time itself. Jacob's body tensed, and his mouth went dry. The words were not just heard, but felt, deep within his chest, like a warning that came from the very heart of creation. The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, and for a moment Jacob thought he saw a flash of recognition in them, as if it knew him, knew his purpose. "The fire that destroyed this place," it continued, "was not just an act of wrath, but a cleansing, a warning to those who walk the earth in arrogance, thinking they are beyond judgment." The air seemed to grow heavier still, the weight of its words pressing against Jacob like an invisible force, a truth that was undeniable and yet horrifying. Jacob's chest tightened as the figure's presence grew ever more oppressive. The air around him had become thick, almost suffocating, and the oppressive heat seemed to intensify by the second. His heart pounded erratically in his chest, each beat sounding like thunder in his ears. His eyes, still locked onto the dark figure, were filled with a mix of terror and disbelief. It was as if everything he had studied in books, all the ancient scriptures and the warnings of divine wrath, had materialized right before him. The words of the figure echoed in his mind, repeating over and over. The fire that destroyed this place was not just an act of wrath, but a cleansing. Jacob could not comprehend what he was hearing. This wasn't just some ancient evil from the past. It was something alive, something with power that had not faded over time. He had come here searching for answers, but instead he found himself standing in the presence of something far beyond human understanding. His legs wobbled, threatening to give out beneath him, but he stood his ground, driven by an urge he couldn't explain. In that moment, he felt that he was not just an observer, but part of something far greater, something that transcended time and place. The figure's voice, if it could be called that, grew louder, the vibrations reverberating through Jacob's very bones. "You wish to know why this city was destroyed?" the figure said, its voice seeping into Jacob's consciousness like a poisonous fog. Sodom and Gomorrah were not just cities of sin, they were hubs of corruption, arrogance, and depravity, centers of power built upon the suffering of the weak, the lust for pleasure, the disregard for life, the violence that was routine in these streets. All of it reached a point where the earth itself could no longer bear the weight of their sins. God's judgment was not a sudden act. It was inevitable. The sins of these cities were the culmination of generations of wickedness, and the fire that fell was the only way to purify a world that had gone so far astray. Jacob's breath quickened as the figure's words seemed to sink deep into his soul, the weight of history pressing against him. He could almost see the images of the cities in his mind, streets overflowing with excess, buildings built on cruelty, a culture so steeped in sin that even the very laws of nature seemed to rebel against them. His eyes drifted to the scorched ruins surrounding him, and it was as if the landscape itself was a testament to the truth of the figure's words. He could almost hear the cries of those who had perished in that fiery wrath, the desperate pleas for mercy that had been too late, drowned out by the roaring flames from the heavens. And yet, despite the warning, the same vices were still thriving in other parts of the world. Was history doomed to repeat itself? The figure before Jacob began to move again, its form shifting in and out of focus, as if it were not fully bound by the laws of the physical world. Jacob's breath became shallow as the temperature around him dropped, and the air turned sharp, biting into his skin. He could feel his own heartbeats, each one louder than the last, as though they were resonating with the very pulse of the earth beneath him. The words of the figure had left him shaken, but something else now took hold of him, a deeper, darker fear that gnawed at the edges of his mind. He had come to these ruins to uncover a truth about the ancient cities, but now he was confronted with a reality far more terrifying. This was no relic of the past, no forgotten chapter of history. It was alive, and it had a message for him, one that would not be ignored. The figure's eyes gleamed brighter now, the fire within them burning like molten rock, and it seemed to gaze directly into Jacob's soul. It spoke again, its voice a low, guttural whisper. "This is not the first time the world has faced judgment. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, but their spirit lives on. Every generation builds on the sins of the last, and in the end, it is not the cities that burn. It is the hearts of men." The words sank deep into Jacob's chest, an unshakable weight, pressing down on him. His mind raced as he tried to piece together what was happening. What did the figure mean by "the spirit lives on"? He thought back to his studies, to the endless pages of biblical texts and archaeological theories, and yet none of it had prepared him for the truth he was facing now. The very idea that the wickedness of those cities might still linger in the world today was a terrifying thought. Had it truly been eradicated? Was there a force, some lingering evil, still at work, shaping the world in ways unseen, spreading corruption across generations? He looked around at the desolate ruins, the scorched earth beneath his feet, and felt an overwhelming sense of dread. This wasn't just about the destruction of two cities, it was about something far greater, something that had been unleashed by the heavens, something that transcended time, and was now warning him, warning the world. He could almost hear the echo of the past in the wind, the faint whispers of those who had once walked these streets, lost to their own sins. The judgment is not over. The figure spoke again, its voice now filled with an unsettling finality. It waits. It always waits. Jacob's mind was reeling, his heart pounding in his chest like a war drum. He felt the weight of the figure's words pressing upon him, suffocating him, as if the very atmosphere was closing in. The figure's glowing eyes seemed to pierce through him, seeing into his very soul. He could feel it now, a terrible, undeniable truth that the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah was not just an event in the past, but a warning for the present, a warning that applied to every generation. As the figure moved closer, the ground beneath Jacob's feet trembled again, and the air grew thick with the stench of sulfur. The heat from the figure's presence radiated outward as if the earth itself were burning, but Jacob could not look away. There was something hypnotic about the figure's gaze, something that kept him rooted in place. "Do you understand now?" the figure asked, its voice no longer a whisper, but a booming, thunderous command that echoed in Jacob's mind. The cities were not destroyed because of a single sin, but because of a culture, a way of life that had embraced corruption so deeply that it could not be undone. You stand in the ashes of that corruption, and you have seen its power. But know this, human, those who do not heed the warnings of the past will fall prey to the same fate. It is not just a story. It is a cycle that continues again and again until there is nothing left but ash and ruin. The figure paused, its form shifting like smoke, before it continued, its voice now quieter but still chilling. "You think you are different. You think the world has changed, but I tell you, nothing has changed. The same vices that destroyed these cities are alive today: greed, lust, violence, and hatred, and they grow stronger with each passing year. The day of reckoning is not far off." Jacob felt the words hit him like a wave, crashing over him with an intensity that left him breathless. His hands began to tremble, his body shaking, not from the heat or the sulfur, but from the sheer weight of the warning he had just received. Was it true? Had humanity truly learned nothing from the past? Was the same darkness, the same corruption, growing unnoticed in the shadows? He tried to steady himself, to find some logical explanation for what was happening, but the figure before him was like nothing he had ever encountered before. It was not just an apparition, it was a presence, a living embodiment of the consequences of sin, and it was telling him that the end was near, that the same judgment that had wiped out Sodom and Gomorrah was waiting for the world again. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the figure's final words reverberated in his mind, each one a terrifying echo that rang louder than any voice he had ever heard. The weight of its warning pressed on him like a heavy stone, and he could feel the ground beneath him quivering as though the very earth was alive, responding to the figure's words. The ruins around him seemed to darken, the air thickening with a palpable sense of dread. His skin prickled as the sulphurous scent became more suffocating, and the temperature continued to climb until it felt like he was standing in the heart of a furnace. Yet, even as his body screamed for relief, his mind remained fixated on the figure before him. The shadows it cast stretched long and twisted across the ground, as if the darkness itself was reaching out to claim him. And still, the figure watched him, its glowing eyes unwavering, knowing that Jacob had come to the brink of understanding something far greater than any of his studies could have prepared him for. "Do you still believe you are in control?" the figure asked, its voice low and resonant, sending a shiver down Jacob's spine. "The world you live in is no different than these cities were. Prosperity, luxury, technology, all built on the backs of those who suffer in silence. You too live in a world of excess, of arrogance, where justice is a fleeting illusion and the powerful tread upon the weak. You hide behind walls, both literal and metaphorical, hoping that your wealth and success will shield you from the consequences of your actions, but they will not. Jacob felt his stomach tighten as the figure spoke, each word a sharp accusation that cut deeper than any physical pain. It was true. He had spent years searching for knowledge, for answers, but he had never once considered the truth that the world itself might be teetering on the edge of destruction. He had become so absorbed in his own quest for answers that he had ignored the decay around him, the same decay that had led to the ruin of Sodom and Gomorrah. The figure's words felt like a mirror, reflecting the sins of the world he had once turned a blind eye to. He could see it now. The greed, the violence, the disregard for others. All of it was still alive, thriving in every corner of the earth. With a sudden, jarring movement, the figure raised one hand, and the ground beneath Jacob seemed to tremble even more violently. A sharp crack sounded, like thunder from the heavens, and for a moment everything around Jacob went silent. Then a flash of blinding light engulfed the figure, and the ground exploded in a violent burst of heat and flame. Jacob's body was thrown backward by the force, landing hard on the ground, his ears ringing from the roar of the explosion. He could feel the heat searing his skin, and the taste of ash and sulfur filled his mouth. The world around him spun in chaos, the once clear desert landscape now a blur of smoke and fire. For a moment Jacob was paralyzed, unable to move, as the reality of the figure's warning crashed down upon him. The heat was unbearable, and yet, in the distance, he thought he saw something like a pillar of smoke rising from the earth, as if it were a sign from the heavens. Jacob's eyes strained through the haze, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. The smoke seemed to twist unnaturally in the air, its shape not that of a natural fire, but something far more deliberate, as if the earth itself was giving birth to the remnants of a long-buried judgment. His heart pounded, his body weak and trembling from the force of the blast. He could taste the acrid sulfur on his tongue, feel it burning his throat with every shallow breath. He had to move. He had to get away, but his legs wouldn't respond. His thoughts were spinning, caught in the grip of the figure's words, the warnings it had spoken still echoing in his mind like a haunting refrain. He had come here for answers, but now he was caught in a nightmare of his own making, a nightmare that was far more real than anything he had ever anticipated. And then, through the smoke, he saw it. At first, it was just a shadow, a faint outline against the blinding light, but it grew clearer with each passing second. It was a figure, a person or something like a person, emerging from the center of the explosion. The heat from the blast seemed to bend around this figure, as if it were untouched by the flames. Jacob's eyes widened as the figure grew larger, its silhouette becoming more defined. It was wearing tattered robes, its face obscured by a hood, but there was something unmistakably powerful about it. The air around it seemed to shimmer, distorting in a way that made Jacob's head spin. This was no ordinary person. It was something otherworldly, something that belonged to another time, another realm, and it was walking toward him. Jacob tried to call out, but his voice was lost in the roar of the flames. His breath came in ragged gasps as he tried to push himself up from the ground, but his limbs felt like they were made of lead. The figure stepped closer, and Jacob could now make out the details. Its hands, long and bony, the nails sharp as though they had never been trimmed, its skin pale and ashen. Its eyes, glowing faintly, seemed to pierce through the smoke as if it could see him, even in the chaos. "You still do not understand," the figure said, its voice a whisper that carried above the crashing fire and wind. "This is not the end. It is only the beginning. You have seen the power that lies within the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, but that power is not gone. It waits, buried beneath the earth, beneath the cities you think are untouchable." Jacob felt a chill run down his spine, his body now shaking uncontrollably as the figure drew nearer. He had thought the explosion, the fire, the terror had been the peak of it all, but this was something else entirely. This figure was a reminder, a living testament to the wrath of God that had once consumed these cities, and now it had returned to remind him, and perhaps the world, that the judgment had not been finished, it had only been delayed. The figure's eyes locked onto his, and Jacob could feel the weight of its gaze, as if it were peering directly into the depths of his soul, reading every part of him that he had tried to bury. The figure stopped just a few feet away from Jacob, its presence suffocating, the air thick with the stench of smoke and burning earth. Jacob could barely move, his mind clouded with 1,000 questions, none of which he could voice. The figure's gaze never wavered, and it seemed to radiate an ancient power, something far beyond human comprehension. It tilted its head slightly, as though studying him, before it spoke again, its voice calm but filled with an undeniable authority. You believe the past is gone. You believe the lessons of Sodom and Gomorrah were for another time. But you are wrong. The sins of those cities are not confined to history. They live on in the hearts of men, in every act of greed, every lie, every crime against one another. Jacob's chest tightened, each word hitting him with the force of a hammer. His mind was racing, his body trembling, unable to fully grasp the enormity of what was happening. Do you know why the cities were destroyed? It wasn't just for their sins. It was for their refusal to change, their arrogance, their belief that they could live without consequence, that they could defy the very laws of creation without suffering for it. And yet, here you stand, in a world no different than theirs. Jacob's blood ran cold as the figure's words sank deep into his mind. Every moment, every piece of his life that he had considered insignificant or mundane, now seemed like part of a larger, far darker pattern. He thought about the world he had returned to, the cities of the modern age, filled with excess, corruption, and an overwhelming sense of entitlement. How many times had he witnessed the disregard for the weak, the exploitation, the cruelty masked as progress? The figure's words haunted him, drawing a connection between the past and present that he could not ignore. It was as if the cycle of sin was alive, growing stronger with every passing day, every unjust action, every greedy decision made by the powerful. The world, it seemed, had learned nothing from the fate of Sodom and Gomorrah, and that realization filled Jacob with a deep, gnawing fear. The figure took a step closer, and Jacob could feel the heat emanating from it, even through the smoke and the searing air. The fire that fell from the heavens, it continued, was not just a punishment. It was a purification, a final cleansing of a world that had lost its way. You stand in that same world, watching the cycle repeat itself, and you must ask yourself, how much longer can it endure? Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, his head spinning, overwhelmed by the weight of the figure's presence and its words. He had come here seeking knowledge, answers about the cities lost to time, but what he had found was far more than he could ever have imagined. The truth was simple yet terrifying. Humanity had not learned from its past. The same mistakes, the same corruption had been carried through the ages, and now the world was teetering on the edge of its own destruction. Jacob felt his knees buckle, and he sank to the ground, unable to stand any longer under the weight of the truth that had just been revealed to him. The figure loomed above him, silent for a moment, as if contemplating what would come next. The figure stood there, motionless, as if giving Jacob a moment to absorb the enormity of what it had just revealed. The air was thick with tension, the ground beneath them still trembling ever so slightly, as if resonating with the words that had been spoken. Jacob's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. He had always believed that history was a series of isolated events, chapters in a book that were meant to be studied and understood. But now it was as if that history was alive, breathing, pulsing right before him, intertwined with the present in ways he couldn't possibly have imagined. The cycle of sin, judgment, and destruction, it was not something that had ended with the fall of ancient cities. It was ongoing, playing out before his eyes in ways he had failed to see. His hands gripped the ground beneath him, the gravel digging into his palms, as the figure's gaze never wavered. Without warning, the figure began to speak once more, its voice cutting through the oppressive silence like a blade. "You seek answers, Jacob, but the truth you are looking for is not one that can be easily understood. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, not just because of their sins, but because they believed they could escape consequence. They believed they were untouchable, invincible. Their wealth, their power, their pride, they thought these would protect them from the inevitable judgment, and yet they fell in an instant, consumed by fire from the heavens." The figure's eyes seemed to flare with intensity as it continued, but their destruction was not a random act. It was an act of divine justice, a warning, a message to the world, to every generation that would follow, that no one is beyond the reach of judgment, not even the mightiest of empires. And that warning has echoed through time. It waits, it always waits, for those who will listen and for those who refuse to change. Jacob's breath caught in his throat as the figure's words settled over him like a heavy cloak. The terror of what was unfolding before him began to sink in deeper. This was not just a tale of past cities. This was a message for him, for the world, for anyone who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. Jacob's heart raced as the figure's words reverberated in his mind, each syllable settling deeper into his consciousness. The heat that radiated from it seemed to intensify, the flames of the surrounding devastation licking the sky. Yet Jacob could not look away. His body ached, but it was as if his very soul was being pulled into a dark revelation. This wasn't just an encounter, it was a warning, a divine message that had transcended time and place. The figure's eyes never left his, and it felt as though it was reading the very depths of his thoughts. The guilt and fear he had carried with him all his life now laid bare. "Look around you, Jacob," the figure said, its voice quieter now but no less potent. "This is not the end. It is the beginning of something much worse. The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were not just destroyed in a day, they were consumed by their own refusal to repent, their refusal to change. That same fate looms over the world today, and there is nothing to stop it except the choice of the people. Will they listen? Will you?" The figure began to fade, its form becoming translucent, as if it were dissolving into the very air around it. The ground trembled once more, and Jacob felt an overwhelming sense of finality, as if this was the last opportunity to hear the message it had brought. The smoke, the flames, the heat, all seemed to surge toward him, engulfing him in a vision of destruction that mirrored the fate of the cities long past. As the figure disappeared completely, its final words lingered in the air like an echo from the past, reaching deep into Jacob's soul. "The judgment of the past is the judgment of the future, and it waits for no one." Jacob stood frozen, the world around him spinning as the terrifying reality of what he had just witnessed took root. He had come seeking knowledge, but what he had found was far more than he had ever bargained for. The world, it seemed, was on the brink, teetering between redemption and destruction, and only those willing to change, to turn away from the corruption that had plagued humanity for centuries, could escape its inevitable fate.